I am going to ask you once, and I need the truth. What is your real name? Grant Sullivan's voice was calm enough that Mason Reed wished he had shouted instead. Around them, the charity gala continued beneath golden chandeliers, with glasses chiming softly and conversations drifting through the elegant Chicago ballroom, as if Mason's entire world had not just stopped. Grant stood several feet away in a tailored black suit, his gray-blue eyes fixed on Mason with an expression stripped of the warmth Mason had spent 3 weeks learning to recognize. Behind him stood Dylan Brooks, the man Grant had actually been supposed to meet. Mason swallowed. There were 100 explanations he could offer, and only one answer that mattered. Mason Reed. Grant stared at him. Mason, he repeated quietly, as though even the name required verification. 3 weeks earlier, Mason had believed the worst thing that could happen on a Friday night was Dylan asking him for another favor. Absolutely not. Mason said into his phone while shelving new releases at the independent bookstore where he worked. You have not even heard the favor. Last month your favor involved carrying a couch up 4 flights of stairs. This one has chairs already. Mason stopped. That somehow sounds worse. Dylan sighed. His aunt had arranged a blind date with Grant Sullivan, a 30-year-old alpha from a prominent Chicago family. Dylan had agreed because refusing meant enduring weeks of family questions. But now the dinner was 3 hours away, and he wanted out. His solution was ridiculous. Mason would go instead. You want me to pretend to be you? For 20 minutes. That is still pretending to be you. Have one drink, be completely incompatible, and leave. He never asks for another date. Everyone moves on. Mason stared at the stack of books in his hands. Why me? Because you are my best friend. That is emotional manipulation. Is it working? Unfortunately, it was. By 7 o'clock, Mason stood outside a polished restaurant near the Chicago River wearing a dark coat over the nicest shirt he owned. The city lights reflected across damp pavement, and the cold evening air made him question every decision that had brought him there. Dylan had given him 3 rules. 20 minutes. No flirting. Absolutely no second date. Mason added a 4th. Do not enjoy yourself. Inside, the hostess led him toward a table near tall windows overlooking the river. Mason rehearsed his plan. Be polite but forgettable. Say something awkward. Finish 1 drink. Escape. Then the man at the table stood. Grant Sullivan was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and somehow more approachable than Mason had prepared for. His charcoal suit was immaculate, but his smile was not polished or rehearsed. It was small, warm, and unexpectedly genuine. Mason forgot every terrible opening line he had prepared. Grant extended his hand. Dylan. Mason looked at that waiting hand, then into Grant's calm gray-blue eyes. Something inside him shifted with embarrassing speed. This was supposed to be the easiest favor Dylan had ever asked. 20 minutes with a stranger Mason would never see again. Instead, Mason accepted Grant's hand and felt his carefully constructed plan begin collapsing before he had even sat down. Yes, Mason said, already aware that the first rule had survived less than 10 seconds. Nice to meet you. Grant smiled again. Mason immediately understood that the second rule was in serious trouble too. Mason had exactly one job: make Grant lose interest. 10 minutes into dinner, he was beginning to suspect he was exceptionally bad at it. He opened the menu and deliberately skipped every elegant entree Dylan would have chosen. I should warn you, Mason said. I distrust any restaurant that puts 3 decorative leaves beside a steak and calls them vegetables. Grant looked up from his menu. That is unusually specific. I have been disappointed before. A smile appeared at the corner of Grant's mouth. Mason silently added humor to the growing list of things going wrong. When the server arrived, Mason ordered a cheeseburger with fries instead of anything remotely sophisticated. Grant closed his menu. Make that too. Mason stared at him. You cannot do that. Order dinner? Copy me. I am trying to establish that I make questionable choices. Maybe I make questionable choices too. Grant's expression remained perfectly serious for 2 seconds before he laughed. Mason looked down at his water, fighting a smile of his own. This was not how the evening was supposed to work. Dylan had described Grant as polished, successful, and probably impossible to impress. Mason had assumed being casual would create immediate incompatibility. Instead, Grant seemed relieved by it. Mason tried another approach. I also hate networking events. So do I. I think expensive bottled water tastes exactly like regular water. Correct. I once left a wedding reception early because someone started explaining cryptocurrency to me. Grant nodded solemnly. That sounds like self-preservation. Mason sighed. You are making this extremely difficult. Making what difficult? Nothing. Mason reached for his water before the truth escaped with the next sentence. Their food arrived, giving him a temporary distraction. He checked his phone beneath the table. Dylan had sent 3 messages. Is he terrible? Has he left yet? Remember the plan. Mason locked the screen. Across from him, Grant dipped a fry into ketchup. Your family described you very differently. Mason almost dropped his burger. They did. Reserved. Formal. Extremely careful about appearances. Mason forced a laugh. Families have selective memories. Apparently. Grant studied him with open curiosity rather than suspicion. I was expecting someone who had researched my company before arriving. I did not even research the menu. I noticed. Mason laughed despite himself. Grant's real smile appeared again, warmer this time. Can I admit something? Grant asked. That depends. I almost canceled tonight. Mason blinked. Why? Grant glanced toward the windows, where Chicago lights shimmered across the river. Arranged introductions usually feel like interviews. People already know my job, my family, the fact that I am an alpha, and whatever else they decided matters before I sit down. His gaze returned to Mason. Then you showed up and complained about decorative vegetables. Mason felt the joke disappear from his expression. For the first time, Grant sounded less like the confident man Dylan had described and more like someone tired of being evaluated before being known. Maybe interviews are overrated, Mason said quietly. Maybe. Grant held his gaze for a moment. Mason became painfully aware that he was no longer performing. Somewhere between the cheeseburger and Grant's confession, he had started talking as himself. His opinions were real. His jokes were real. The way he wanted Grant to keep smiling was becoming dangerously real too. Mason checked the time. 7:22. According to the plan, he had 2 minutes left. He should finish his drink, invent an excuse, and disappear from Grant Sullivan's life forever. Instead, Grant leaned back and asked, "Do you like chocolate cake?" Mason knew the correct answer was no. He knew exactly what Dylan would tell him to do. He also knew he wanted another 20 minutes. Unfortunately, Mason said, I have very strong opinions about chocolate cake. Grant smiled and reached for the dessert menu. Then I think I need to hear them. Mason watched him open it and realized rule number 1 had officially failed. The frightening part was that Mason no longer wanted to save it. By the time the chocolate cake disappeared, Mason had stopped checking the clock because every glance reminded him that he should already be gone. Grant listened to Mason defend the importance of warm cake and cold vanilla ice cream with the seriousness of a man attending a business presentation, then finally said, I think you have spent more time analyzing dessert than most people spend choosing a mortgage. Mason pointed his fork at him. Dessert has immediate consequences. Grant laughed, and Mason felt another piece of his original plan quietly disappear. The conversation moved from food to books, then from books to work. Mason carefully avoided giving Grant details that would directly contradict anything Dylan's family might have said, but almost everything else came naturally. He talked about working at an independent bookstore, helping customers find novels they did not know they wanted, and someday dreaming of having a small bookstore of his own. Grant admitted that he worked in commercial real estate, but disliked how. Quickly people assumed that meant he cared only about money and expensive buildings. So what do you care about? Mason asked. Grant considered the question. Building something that still matters after people stop being impressed by it. Mason became quiet. It was not the kind of answer he had expected. At 9:45, they finally stepped outside. Nearly 3 hours had passed. Chicago had settled into a cold, misty night, with headlights reflecting across damp streets and the river carrying broken ribbons of light between the buildings. Which way are you headed? Grant asked. Mason pointed toward the train station. I can walk with you. You do not have to. I know. That answer made Mason smile. They walked beside the river instead of taking the shortest route. A light rain began halfway there, and Grant suggested stopping beneath the awning of a small coffee shop that was preparing to close. Minutes later, he returned carrying 2 paper cups. Coffee? Mason asked. Hot chocolate. Mason accepted one. You remembered the cake discussion. It was difficult to forget. They continued beneath the city lights, moving slowly enough that Mason suspected neither of them wanted to reach the station. Eventually, Grant glanced at him. Can I tell you something strange? Mason tightened his hands around the warm cup. That depends on how strange. You are nothing like the person I expected tonight. Mason's steps slowed. There it was. The moment he had known would come. He could end the mistake now. No more pretending. No second date built on a borrowed name. Grant, there is something I should tell you. Grant stopped beneath the shelter of a building entrance as the rain grew steadier. His gray-blue eyes settled on Mason. All right. Mason drew a breath. The person you thought you were meeting tonight is not exactly. I am glad, Grant said softly. Mason froze. What? I am glad you are not what I expected. Grant gave him that same genuine smile from the restaurant. I expected someone polished and careful, someone who would spend dinner trying to impress me. Instead, I met someone who ordered a cheeseburger, insulted decorative vegetables, and argued with me about chocolate cake. Mason looked down at his cup. The truth was sitting directly behind his teeth, but suddenly saying it felt like destroying something before he understood what it could become. Grant continued, I like the person I met tonight. Mason's heart answered before his conscience could. When they finally reached the station entrance, Grant stopped. I would like to see you again. Mason knew the correct answer. He had known it since 7 o'clock. Say no. Tell the truth. Walk away. Instead, he looked at Grant and heard himself say, I would like that too. Grant smiled. Tuesday. Mason descended the station stairs with his pulse racing. His phone vibrated before he reached the platform. Dylan had sent another message. Did he hate me? Mason stared at the screen for several seconds before typing back. No. Then he added 4 words that made the situation frighteningly real. I think he likes me. Tuesday evening arrived too quickly. Mason spent most of the day at the bookstore rehearsing ways to tell Grant the truth, but every version sounded worse when spoken aloud. By 6:30, he had decided on something simple. Meet Grant, confess before dinner, apologize, and accept whatever happened next. Grant was waiting outside a small Italian restaurant in River North when Mason arrived, holding 2 coffee cups beneath the glow of the entrance lights. You are early, Mason said. So are you. Grant handed him 1 cup. Mason took a careful sip and stopped. Caramel latte? You mentioned Friday that you liked them. Mason stared at him. That was 1 sentence. I was listening. Those 3 words nearly destroyed Mason's courage. Inside, they were seated near a window overlooking the busy street. Mason tried twice to begin his confession, but each attempt was interrupted by ordinary moments that felt increasingly precious. Grant asked about the bookstore. Mason told him about a customer who had spent 40 minutes searching for a novel he remembered only as Blue. Grant laughed hard enough that Mason forgot, briefly, that he was supposed to be terrified. After dinner, Grant suggested walking. Tuesday became another evening that ended. Too late, and the truth remained unspoken. Then Tuesday somehow became Thursday coffee, Saturday lunch, and a Sunday afternoon along the Chicago River walk. Grant began sending Mason good morning messages before work. Mason started recognizing the exact moment Grant's professional politeness disappeared and his genuine smile emerged. Grant learned that Mason always read the last page of mystery novels too early, could never pass a dog without smiling, and secretly wanted to own a neighborhood bookstore someday. Mason learned that Grant drank black coffee, disliked crowded clubs, called his mother every Sunday, and kept an old paperback mystery novel in his office because it had belonged to his grandfather. None of those conversations belonged to Dylan. That was what made the situation both beautiful and unbearable. Grant was not falling for a fictional personality Mason had created. He was learning Mason read piece by piece while continuing to call him Dylan. One cold evening, they stopped at a bakery after dinner and shared a slice of chocolate cake. Mason automatically pushed the larger half toward Grant. You always do that, Grant said. Do what? Give me the better half and pretend it happened accidentally. Mason looked at the plate. Maybe I am bad at geometry. You work in a bookstore. Exactly. Numbers are outside my jurisdiction. Grant laughed, then grew quiet. I like this. Mason glanced up. Cake. This. Us. The words settled between them with unexpected weight. Mason's smile faded slightly. Grant, there are things you do not know about me. There are things I do not know about everyone. That is not what I mean. Grant watched him carefully. Mason could feel the truth rising again. The person you think I am, he stopped. Grant waited without interrupting. Mason hated himself for needing the silence to become easier. It did not. Finally, Grant spoke. My family gave me a description of you before our first dinner. Mason's chest tightened. I remember. They were completely wrong. Grant smiled faintly. And I am grateful. Mason looked away toward the bakery window, where pedestrians moved beneath the Chicago streetlights. Grant continued. I do not care who they expected you to be. I care about the man who works around books all day, makes terrible jokes, and gives away half his dessert. Mason felt happiness and guilt collide so sharply that he could barely answer. What if you learn something about me that changes everything? Grant considered him for a moment. Then tell me, and let me decide what it changes. Mason went still. The answer was gentle, but it landed harder than anger could have. Grant had just offered him exactly what Mason had been denying him since the first night. A choice. Mason knew the next words should be the truth. Instead, fear won again, and he whispered, I will. Grant smiled and reached for another bite of cake. Mason returned the smile, but something inside him had shifted. Every day Grant knew him better, the borrowed name mattered more. And for the first time, Mason understood that waiting was no longer protecting what they had. It was becoming the very thing that could destroy it. Grant's words stayed with Mason for the next 2 days. Tell me, and let me decide what it changes. Mason heard them while shelving books, while riding the train home, and every time Grant sent a message that made him smile before guilt pulled the smile away. By Thursday evening, Mason had made a decision. He asked Grant to meet him at a quiet park near the river after work. The wind coming off the water was cold, and the Chicago skyline glowed against the fading blue sky. Grant arrived carrying 2 coffees. Let me guess, Mason said. Caramel latte. Grant handed him the cup. You are becoming predictable. That sounds like a complaint. It is becoming a problem. They walked along the path until they reached an empty bench overlooking the river. Grant sat beside Mason, leaving only a comfortable distance between them. For several minutes, they watched boats move slowly beneath the city lights. Then Grant spoke. My father used to bring me here when I was younger. Mason turned toward him. Grant rarely talked about his family without changing the subject. He had very specific ideas about what an alpha should become, Grant continued. Successful career, the right connections, the right relationship. Everything planned before I was old enough to decide whether I wanted any of it. Is that why you hate arranged dates? Partly. Grant looked down at his coffee. People sometimes meet Grant Sullivan after they have already decided what Grant Sullivan represents. My family, my career, an alpha with the right last name. His expression softened. Then I met you. Mason's chest tightened. Grant, you did not care about any of that. You made fun of my restaurant choices within 10 minutes. Technically, I made fun of the vegetables. An important distinction. Mason smiled, but it disappeared almost immediately. He could not accept another sincere confession while protecting the lie that had created it. He placed his coffee beside the bench. Grant, I need to tell you who I really am. Grant became still. All right. Mason forced himself to continue. The first night we met, I came there because, wait. Grant turned toward him, suddenly looking less confident than Mason had ever seen him. Before you say anything, maybe I need to say something too. Mason's heart sank. Grant, you really do not. I think I do. Grant drew a breath. I have spent the last week wondering whether I am imagining this. I look forward to your messages. When something ridiculous happens at work, you are the person I want to tell. When I pass a bookstore, I think about you. I have even started judging restaurant vegetables. Mason gave a helpless laugh. Grant smiled, but there was nervousness behind it. What I am trying to say is that this stopped feeling like a few dates to me. Mason stared at him. The confession he had rehearsed suddenly felt impossibly far away. Grant continued. If you were about to tell me that you feel something too, you do not have to be afraid of saying it. Mason closed his eyes for one brief second. This was the moment. Not tomorrow. Not after another dinner. Now, I do feel something, Mason admitted. Grant's expression softened immediately. So do I. Mason should have continued. My name is Mason Reed. Dylan was supposed to meet you. Instead, he let Grant's relief fill the silence. Grant slowly offered his hand between them, giving Mason every opportunity to refuse. Mason looked at it, then placed his hand in Grant's. The gesture was simple and warm, and that made the guilt worse. Grant smiled toward the river. Mason could not. His feelings were real. Grant's feelings were real. Only the name between them was false. Mason finally understood that he had crossed the last safe boundary. Until tonight, he could pretend he was protecting a possibility. Now Grant had trusted him with his heart, and Mason had answered with another silence. As they stood to leave, Mason made himself one promise. There would not be another almost confession. The next time he told Grant who he really was, he would finish every word. For the next 2 days, Mason discovered that avoiding Grant did not make the truth easier. It only made every unanswered message feel heavier. On Friday afternoon, Mason was rearranging a display near the front of the bookstore when the bell above the door rang. He looked up and nearly dropped the novel in his hand. Grant stood inside wearing a dark wool coat and holding 2 coffee cups. "You found me," Mason said. Grant raised an eyebrow. "You told me where you work, right? That makes this significantly less mysterious." Grant handed him a cup. "Caramel latte." "Of course." "You have been quiet," Grant said. Mason looked down at the lid. "Work has been busy." It was a weak excuse, and Grant clearly knew it, but he did not challenge him. Before Mason could say more, an older customer approached asking for a birthday gift for her husband. Mason apologized and went to help her. Then a college student needed a recommendation for a history book. A father and his young daughter followed, searching for an adventure novel she could read over the weekend. 20 minutes disappeared before Mason finally returned. "Sorry." Grant was smiling. "Do not apologize. You have been standing here forever. I was watching you." Mason gave him a suspicious look. "That sounds alarming." "You know what I mean." Grant glanced around at the crowded shelves, handwritten recommendation cards, and warm lamps. "You are different here." Mason's stomach tightened. "Different how?" "Relaxed. You stop thinking about what you were supposed to say." Grant nodded toward the young girl, leaving with her book. "You just become yourself." The words landed with painful precision. Mason stared at the coffee in his hands. "What if you do not know who that is?" Grant's expression changed. "Then let me learn." No pressure, no demand, just the same choice Mason had been afraid to give him. Mason finally understood that waiting for the perfect confession was only another form of hiding. He could not keep choosing the safest moment because no safe moment existed anymore. Grant reached inside his coat and removed a cream-colored invitation. "My company is hosting a charity gala tomorrow night at a hotel downtown. There will be local businesses, community groups, donors, and enough family acquaintances to make me reconsider every life decision that brought me there." Mason almost smiled. "You are really selling it." "There will be chocolate cake." "Better." Grant held out the invitation. "Come with me." Mason hesitated. A crowded gala connected to Grant's professional and family circles was exactly where a borrowed identity could become dangerous. For once, that possibility did not make Mason want to escape. It made the decision simple. "I will come." Grant smiled. Mason took the invitation but did not look away. "There is something I need to tell you tomorrow." Grant's smile faded into concern. "Something serious?" "Yes." Mason forced himself to continue. "And if I lose my nerve, do not let me change the subject." Grant studied him for a moment. "All right. Promise." "I promise." After Grant left, Mason stood beside the bookstore window, watching him disappear into the Chicago afternoon. Then he pulled out his phone and called Dylan. His friend answered on the second ring. "Everything okay?" "No," Mason said, "but I am going to make it right." Dylan became quiet. Mason looked down at the invitation. "Tomorrow night, I am telling Grant everything. Your name, my name, the dinner, all of it." "Are you sure?" "I should have done it 3 weeks ago." For the first time since that first Friday, Mason felt strangely calm. He had finally stopped searching for a way to keep Grant without risking the truth. Tomorrow, Grant would get the choice Mason owed him. Mason simply did not know that by the time he tried to confess, the truth would already be standing inside the ballroom waiting for him. Saturday evening, Mason entered the downtown Chicago hotel with one promise repeating in his mind. Grant would hear the truth from him tonight. The ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, filled with formally dressed guests from local businesses, community organizations, and families who seemed to know one another from years of charity events. Soft jazz drifted across the room, while servers moved between conversations carrying sparkling water and appetizers. Mason adjusted his navy suit and immediately spotted Grant approaching through the crowd. Grant's expression brightened when he saw him. "You came." "I said I would." Grant stopped beside him. "You also said we needed to talk." Mason was relieved he remembered. "We do. Somewhere private." Grant studied his face, then nodded toward a quiet hallway beyond the ballroom. Come on. They had barely taken 3 steps when one of Grant's colleagues stopped him to discuss a donor. Another guest approached immediately afterward. Mason waited, growing more anxious with every passing minute. Grant kept glancing toward him, silently promising that he had not forgotten. Finally, after nearly 15 minutes, Grant politely excused himself. Now, he said. No interruptions. Mason followed him toward the edge of the ballroom, mentally repeating the words he had practiced all afternoon. My name is Mason Reed. Dylan asked me to take his place. Everything else you learned about me was real. Then a familiar voice came from behind him. Mason. Mason stopped. Dylan Brooks stood near the ballroom entrance beside his aunt, both dressed for the gala. Dylan's surprise became immediate alarm when he noticed Grant. Mason felt every carefully rehearsed sentence disappear. Grant looked from Mason to the newcomer. Friend of yours? Before Mason could answer, Dylan's aunt approached with a welcoming smile. Mr. Sullivan, I am glad we finally get to meet properly. Grant greeted her politely, though confusion had already entered his expression. She gestured toward Dylan. And this is my nephew, Dylan Brooks. I believe our families arranged for the two of you to have dinner a few weeks ago. Mason felt the entire room fall away. Grant did not speak. His eyes settled on Dylan, then slowly moved back to Mason. Every inconsistency from the last 3 weeks seemed to connect behind those gray-blue eyes. The family description that never matched. Mason's strange hesitation whenever their first meeting came up. Every unfinished confession. Grant's face became unreadable. I'm going to ask you once, and I need the truth. What is your real name? Mason swallowed. There was nowhere left to hide. Mason Reed. Grant repeated it quietly. Mason. Yes. Grant glanced toward Dylan. He was supposed to be at the restaurant? Mason nodded. Dylan did not want to go. He asked me to take his place. It was supposed to last 20 minutes. But you stayed. Because I liked you. Grant's expression tightened. And afterward, I kept trying to tell you. Trying. Mason lowered his eyes. I was afraid that if I told you, I would lose you. Grant was silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice remained controlled. Then who have I been falling for? Mason looked directly at him. Me. Grant. Everything that mattered was me. The bookstore, the jokes, the coffee, the books, the things I told you about my life. Those were mine. My feelings were mine. Grant's eyes softened for one painful instant. That is why this hurts. Mason could not answer. Grant continued quietly. You asked what would happen if I learned something that changed everything. I told you to let me decide. I remember. But you never did. Mason felt the truth of those words more sharply than any accusation. No, I did not. Every time you stayed silent, you made the decision for me. Mason nodded. I am sorry. Grant looked at him for a long moment. I believe you. Hope rose before Mason could stop it. Then Grant stepped back. And I believe your feelings were real. But trust was real too. Mason understood. For once, he did not reach for an excuse. What do you need? Grant looked toward the ballroom doors. Time. Mason forced himself to accept the answer without bargaining. Okay. Grant gave a small nod and walked away. Mason remained beneath the warm chandelier light as Dylan approached quietly from behind. Mason watched Grant disappear through the doors and finally understood the mistake that had mattered most. He had spent 3 weeks fearing Grant would discover he was the wrong man, when the truth was that Grant had fallen for the right man all along. Mason had simply never trusted him enough to know his real name. Sunday morning arrived without a message from Grant. Mason checked his phone before getting out of bed, then reminded himself that Grant had asked for time, not reassurance. Monday was harder. At the bookstore, every familiar detail seemed connected to him. The mystery section reminded Mason of Grant's grandfather's old paperback. The coffee shop across the street reminded him of caramel lattes. Each time the bell above the bookstore door rang, Mason looked up before he could stop himself. Grant never appeared. Dylan came by late that afternoon and found Mason reorganizing a display that had already been perfectly organized. I am sorry, Dylan said. Mason kept arranging books. You did not make me lie for 3 weeks. I started it. Then own your part. I have to own mine. Dylan leaned against the counter. Are you going to call him? Mason had considered it dozens of times. He had imagined sending Grant a long explanation describing every failed confession and every reason fear had won. But explanations suddenly felt like another attempt to control Grant's decision. No, Mason said. He asked for time. By Tuesday night, Mason understood what he could offer without demanding anything in return. He opened their message thread and typed slowly. Friday, 7 o'clock. Same restaurant. Mason, read this time. I will understand if you do not come. He read the message twice before sending it. No answer came Tuesday. None came Wednesday or Thursday. On Friday evening, Mason nearly convinced himself that showing up would only make him feel foolish. He went anyway. At 6:50, he entered the restaurant near the Chicago River where everything had begun. The same tall windows overlooked the water, and the same warm lights reflected against the glass. This time, Mason wore his own charcoal sweater beneath his dark coat. No borrowed identity. No instructions from Dylan. No plan for making someone like him. The hostess led him to a table near the windows. Will someone be joining you? Mason looked at the empty chair across from him. Maybe. At 7 o'clock, it remained empty. At 7:10, Mason ordered water. At 7:15, he stopped looking toward the entrance every time the door opened. At 7:20, disappointment settled into something quieter. Grant had been given a choice, and Mason had promised himself that whatever Grant chose would be respected. That promise mattered most when the answer hurt. Mason looked through the window at the Chicago River and remembered their first dinner. Back then, he had believed the danger was telling Grant the truth and losing him. Now he understood that hiding the truth had been another way of refusing to trust him. At 7:25, Mason stood and reached for his coat. He thanked the server and turned toward the exit. It hurt, but he did not feel cheated. Grant owed him nothing. For once, Mason had told the truth before asking for something in return. He had offered a door and left Grant free to walk through it or leave it closed. Mason took 2 steps. Is this seat taken? He stopped. He knew the voice immediately. Grant stood beside the table, his dark hair slightly damp from the cold mist outside, his expression guarded but calm. Mason's heart raced, but he did not move toward him. I thought you were not coming. Grant looked at the empty chair. I almost did not. I would have understood. I know. Grant removed his coat, but remained standing. That is one reason I came. Mason waited. Grant studied him for several seconds. Why did you not call me? Because you asked for time. And the message? Mason swallowed. I wanted to see you. But wanting something from you does not mean I get to decide what you should give me. Something in Grant's face softened. He pulled out the chair and sat down. Mason slowly returned to his seat. The same. Restaurant surrounded them, but nothing felt the same. There was no Dylan Brooks sitting between them anymore. No borrowed name. No secret waiting for the right moment. Mason took a breath. Hi, he said quietly. I am Mason Reed. Grant held his gaze, and after a long moment, the faintest smile appeared. Grant Sullivan. He opened the menu. It is nice to finally meet you, Mason. Grant did not offer forgiveness with the menu. He simply stayed, and Mason understood that staying was already more than he had any right to expect. When the server approached, Mason ordered the same cheeseburger he had chosen during their first dinner. Grant looked at him for a moment, then ordered one too. Mason almost smiled. Still copying me? I am collecting evidence about your questionable choices. The familiar joke eased something between them, but neither man pretended everything had returned to normal. After the server left, Grant folded his hands on the table. I have questions. Mason nodded. Ask anything. Why did you agree to Dylan's plan? Because he is my best friend. He panicked, and I thought 20 awkward minutes would become a ridiculous story we would laugh about later. When did it stop being ridiculous? Mason met Grant's eyes. When you stood up and smiled at me. Grant looked genuinely surprised. That quickly, embarrassingly quickly. A faint smile touched Grant's face before disappearing. And everything you told me afterward? The bookstore, my family, the books I love, wanting my own shop someday, my terrible opinions about restaurant vegetables, all of it was mine. Mason paused. I borrowed Dylan's name. I did not invent Mason Reed. Grant absorbed that quietly. That makes it easier and harder at the same time. I know. Do you? Grant asked, not unkindly. Mason thought before answering. I think I do now. I kept telling myself I was afraid of losing you, but that made everything about what I wanted. Every time I stayed silent, I denied you the chance to decide whether you wanted the truth and me together. Grant's expression softened. That is what hurt. Mason nodded. I am sorry. I know. Their food arrived, and conversation began. Easier after that, not because the problem disappeared, but because nothing else was hidden. Mason answered every question without searching for the safest version of the truth. When dessert came, Grant ordered chocolate cake without asking. Mason stared at the plate. Some traditions survive. I am willing to negotiate. They shared it slowly. When only 2 bites remained, Mason pushed the larger one toward Grant. Grant looked at the plate, then at him. You really do always give me the better half. Apparently that part was true too. This time Grant smiled fully. After dinner, they stepped outside into the cold Chicago night. The river reflected towers of white and gold, and the sidewalks still carried a faint shine from the evening mist. They walked several blocks before Grant stopped beneath a streetlight. If we try again, I cannot pretend nothing happened. I would not ask you to. No borrowed names. No half-truths because you are afraid of my reaction. If something is difficult, you tell me while it is still difficult. Mason took a slow breath. That is the relationship I want to. Grant extended his hand, stopping halfway between them. This time there was no mistake attached to the gesture. Mason placed his hand in Grant's, and they continued walking. 3 months later, on a bright Saturday afternoon, Mason stepped outside the bookstore and found Dylan waiting with 2 coffees. Across the street, Grant emerged from a bakery carrying a small white box. Dylan followed Mason's gaze and grinned. I have a philosophical question. Mason accepted a coffee. That sounds dangerous. Technically, Grant was supposed to be my blind date. Mason raised an eyebrow. Technically, you never showed up. Minor detail. Grant crossed the street and stopped beside Mason. Dylan looked between them. So was he my date or yours? Mason turned toward Grant. The same gray-blue eyes that had unsettled him across a restaurant 3 months earlier now met his without a single secret between them. Mason reached for Grant's hand, and Grant intertwined their fingers naturally. Yours for 20 minutes, Mason said. Grant smiled and gently squeezed his hand as they started. Down the sidewalk together. Mason looked at him and finished. Mine ever since.